It was 3 a.m. on a moonless night in 1940. French sentries stationed along the Ardennes forest heard something that defied explanation. The sound of an entire German division advancing through terrain that should have been impassable in complete darkness. When dawn broke, they discovered something far more terrifying than enemy tactics. The German soldiers they encountered had been marching continuously for 72 hours straight. Their pupils dilated to pinpoints, moving with mechanical precision that seemed almost inhuman. These men showed no signs of exhaustion, no response to pain, and an unsettling disconnection from reality that chilled even battle-hardened veterans. What the French defenders witnessed that morning was the result of the most dangerous military experiment in human history, one involving a small white pill that promised to create the perfect soldier, but instead created monsters. In 1937, a Berlin-based pharmaceutical company called Temmler Werk began marketing a revolutionary new stimulant under the brand name Pervitin. The timing couldn't have been more perfect for a nation rebuilding itself after economic devastation. Within 12 months, this methamphetamine-based substance had swept through civilian German society with unprecedented velocity, creating what historians would later describe as the world's first mass chemical enhancement phenomenon. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Housewives who had struggled to maintain their energy through endless domestic duties suddenly found themselves capable of working from dawn until midnight without fatigue. Students discovered they could study for days on end, absorbing information with laser-like focus that seemed almost supernatural. Factory workers, previously limited by human endurance, began powering through shifts that lasted well into the night, maintaining peak productivity levels that defied biological limitations. The substance promised everything an exhausted population desperately craved: unlimited energy, heightened focus, enhanced physical performance, and most remarkably, the ability to function on minimal sleep for extended periods. What made Pervitin particularly seductive to German society was its unprecedented availability. Unlike other controlled substances of the era, this could be purchased at any German pharmacy without a prescription, medical supervision, or even basic safety warnings. Citizens lined up at drugstores across the Reich, convinced they had discovered the key to unlocking superhuman performance. Pharmacists reported running out of stock within hours of receiving new shipments. The demand was so intense that Temmler Werke struggled to maintain adequate production levels, even after dramatically expanding their manufacturing facilities. Advertisements proclaimed Pervitin as the definitive solution to modern life's increasing demands. Marketing materials depicted energetic individuals conquering their daily challenges with unprecedented vigor and enthusiasm. The pharmaceutical company painted a compelling picture of a substance that could unlock human potential without consequence, side effects, or long-term complications. German society embraced this chemical enhancement with an enthusiasm that bordered on religious fervor. Medical professionals initially praised Pervitin's effects, noting improvements in worker productivity, student academic performance, and general civilian morale. Early medical literature described the substance as a breakthrough in pharmacological science, representing humanity's first successful attempt to chemically optimize human performance. The medical establishment's endorsement provided scientific legitimacy that accelerated public acceptance. What the civilian population didn't realize was that they were participating in an unprecedented social experiment in mass chemical enhancement. The long-term effects remained completely unstudied, and the potential for dependency, psychological damage, or physiological harm was entirely unknown. German society had essentially become a massive laboratory for testing the limits of pharmaceutical human modification. But the true power of Pervitin wouldn't be revealed until military leaders recognized its staggering potential for warfare applications. What happened next would transform not just individual soldiers, but fundamentally alter the entire nature of combat itself, creating a new category of chemical warfare that targeted a nation's own forces. As political tensions across Europe escalated throughout the late 1930s, German military physicians began conducting systematic studies of Pervitin's effects on physical performance, mental alertness, and combat readiness. Their findings exceeded every expectation and challenged fundamental assumptions about human limitations in warfare. Test subjects demonstrated remarkable endurance capabilities, maintaining peak performance levels for extended periods without the typical decline associated with fatigue, hunger, or sleep deprivation. The initial military trials were conducted in complete secrecy at remote training facilities across Germany. Volunteer soldiers were given precise doses of Pervitin and then subjected to increasingly demanding physical and mental challenges. The results were so extraordinary that military doctors initially questioned their own methodology, suspecting measurement errors or psychological placebo effects. However, repeated testing confirmed the substance's remarkable impact on human performance. Soldiers could march continuously for distances that should have required multiple days of travel. Complex military maneuvers that normally demanded hours of careful coordination were completed with unprecedented speed and precision. Most significantly, sleep became almost entirely unnecessary for extended periods, and pain responses were dramatically reduced, allowing personnel to continue functioning despite injuries that would normally incapacitate ordinary soldiers. These preliminary studies caught the attention of Germany's highest military leadership, who recognized the strategic implications immediately. If an entire army could operate without the traditional constraints of human endurance, it would fundamentally alter the balance of power in European warfare. Traditional military doctrine relied on predictable patterns of advance, rest, and consolidation. An army that could eliminate the rest component would possess an almost insurmountable tactical advantage. By early 1939, military strategists had ordered an unprecedented 35 million doses of Pervitin in preparation for upcoming military operations, particularly the planned invasion of France. These supplies were systematically distributed among 3 million German troops, representing one of history's largest pharmaceutical experiments in human enhancement. Each soldier received tablets containing precisely 3 milligrams of the active compound, a dose carefully calculated to maximize combat effectiveness while minimizing immediately visible side effects. The timing of this mass distribution was deliberately coordinated with Germany's revolutionary military strategy, known as Blitzkrieg, lightning war. This tactical approach required soldiers to maintain relentless, continuous pressure on enemy forces, advancing without pause for traditional rest periods or supply consolidation. Human limitations had historically made such sustained aggression impossible to maintain. Pervitin promised to eliminate those biological constraints entirely. Military medical officers developed sophisticated distribution protocols to ensure consistent supply to frontline units. Each company-level medic carried standardized quantities of Pervitin alongside traditional medical equipment. Soldiers received their initial doses before major operations, with additional tablets available during extended engagements. The military had essentially industrialized chemical enhancement, transforming an entire national army into unwitting participants in a massive pharmaceutical experiment. Training protocols were modified to incorporate Pervitin's effects into standard combat procedures. Soldiers learned to operate effectively while under the substance's influence, adjusting their tactics to account for enhanced endurance and altered pain perception. Military doctrine was rewritten to exploit the advantages that chemical enhancement provided, creating new strategic possibilities that had never existed in traditional warfare. Soldiers quickly developed their own terminology for the tablets, calling them Stuka pills, after the dive bombers that screamed overhead during attacks, or simply Go pills and energy tablets. These casual nicknames belied the profound physiological and psychological transformation occurring within their bodies. What they didn't realize was that they were participating in the largest pharmacological experiment in military history, with consequences that would extend far beyond any individual battle or campaign. Yet the most shocking revelations about Pervitin's battlefield impact were still to come, as German forces prepared to unleash their chemically enhanced war machine upon an unprepared and unsuspecting Europe. The stage was set for a demonstration of chemical human enhancement that would redefine the very nature of warfare itself. When German forces crossed into Poland in September 1939, they moved with an intensity and coordination that stunned military observers worldwide. Traditional warfare relied on calculated advances, strategic pauses for resupply and reorganization, and necessary periods of consolidation to maintain unit cohesion. The German approach abandoned these time-tested conventions entirely, creating a new paradigm of continuous, relentless military pressure that seemed to defy human limitations. The invasion provided the first large-scale demonstration of Pervitin's battlefield effects. Though Allied intelligence initially attributed German success to superior tactics and equipment rather than chemical enhancement, German soldiers advanced without stopping, often covering distances that should have required multiple days of careful marching in mere hours. More remarkably, they maintained complex tactical coordination throughout these extended movements, suggesting that their enhanced endurance came without any corresponding decrease in mental acuity or decision-making capability. Polish defenders found themselves confronting an enemy that operated according to completely different rules of engagement. German forces appeared at locations where military doctrine suggested they shouldn't be able to arrive for days, having traversed difficult terrain at speeds that seemed impossible for infantry units carrying full combat equipment. Traditional defensive strategies based on predictable patterns of enemy movement and necessary rest periods became completely ineffective against forces that never paused to rest. The invasion of France in May 1940 provided an even more dramatic and thoroughly documented demonstration of Pervitin's transformative battlefield impact. German tank crews operated their vehicles continuously for 3 consecutive days without rest, maintaining complex tactical maneuvers and coordinated attacks, while their French counterparts struggled to comprehend the unprecedented pace of the assault. These weren't brief sprints followed by recuperation, but sustained operations that continued around the clock. Infantry units accomplished feats that military historians had previously considered impossible. Entire divisions marched through terrain previously classified as impassable, arriving at strategic positions while defenders were still establishing their fortifications. The famous breakthrough at Sedan involved German forces moving continuously for over 60 hours, crossing rivers, navigating forests, and maintaining tactical formations without any significant pause for rest or reorganization. French military reports from this period describe encounters with German soldiers who seemed completely immune to conventional deterrence. Small arms fire that should have forced tactical retreats was ignored entirely, with advancing soldiers continuing their missions despite obvious wounds and casualties around them. Many French defenders reported that German troops appeared to be operating in a trance-like state, mechanically pursuing their objectives regardless of losses, obstacles, or conventional tactical considerations. The psychological impact on opposing forces was devastating, and perhaps more significant than the purely physical advantages that Pervitin provided. Allied soldiers found themselves confronting enemies who operated according to completely different rules of human endurance and pain tolerance. The knowledge that German forces could maintain aggressive operations around the clock created a constant state of anxiety and uncertainty among defensive positions. Defenders could never predict when or where the next assault would materialize, as their enemies seemed capable of striking at any hour without warning or apparent need for preparation time. British intelligence reports documented instances of German soldiers walking continuously for distances exceeding 50 kilometers, while carrying full combat equipment, weapons, and supplies. Traditional military doctrine based on centuries of warfare experience suggested such feats were physically impossible for ordinary humans operating under combat conditions. Yet entire German divisions were accomplishing these advances as standard operating procedure, fundamentally altering the strategic balance of European warfare. The speed of German success during the French campaign wasn't solely due to superior tactics or equipment, though these factors remained important. The ability to maintain continuous pressure, to appear where enemies least expected, and to operate effectively without traditional rest periods created a synergistic effect that multiplied the impact of conventional military advantages. Pervitin had essentially eliminated one of warfare's fundamental constraints, the need for human forces to rest and recover. But beneath this apparent invincibility and supernatural military effectiveness, disturbing changes were beginning to manifest within the German military machine itself. The first signs of Pervitin's darker consequences were already emerging, though military leadership remained focused on immediate tactical advantages rather than long-term sustainability concerns. By late 1940, German military medical staff began documenting increasingly troubling side effects among troops who had been using Pervitin regularly during combat operations. The early reports, initially dismissed as isolated incidents or combat stress, mentioned concerning adverse effects, including severe cardiovascular problems, circulation disorders, and what medical personnel described as nervous system irregularities. Soldiers who had been consuming the substance for extended periods displayed symptoms that military doctors had never encountered in previous combat situations. The most disturbing cases involved personnel who had been using Pervitin continuously for several weeks or months during sustained campaigns. These individuals exhibited behavioral patterns that seriously alarmed their commanding officers and fellow soldiers. Some became obsessively focused on minor, seemingly irrelevant details, spending hours compulsively cleaning weapons that were already spotless, or arranging equipment with meticulous precision that served no tactical purpose. The obsessive behavior often interfered with essential military duties and unit coordination. Others displayed sudden, unpredictable bursts of aggression directed toward fellow soldiers, creating serious discipline problems within previously cohesive military units. These weren't typical combat stress reactions, but explosive episodes of violence that seemed to emerge without warning or apparent provocation. Unit commanders found themselves dealing with personnel who might function normally for days, then suddenly become dangerous to their own comrades during critical operations. Sleep patterns among long-term Pervitin users became severely and permanently disrupted. Even when the substance was temporarily unavailable, affected soldiers found themselves completely unable to achieve restful sleep. Many reported experiencing vivid, terrifying nightmares and visual hallucinations that persisted for days or weeks after their last dose. These sleep disorders weren't temporary withdrawal symptoms, but appeared to represent permanent neurological damage that continued indefinitely. The hallucinations were particularly troubling because they often occurred during active combat situations. Soldiers reported seeing enemy forces that weren't present, hearing commands that were never issued, or perceiving threats that existed only in their chemically altered perception of reality. These episodes created dangerous situations where affected personnel might fire on their own forces or abandon defensive positions to pursue imaginary enemies. Unit cohesion began suffering dramatically as exhausted, psychologically unstable personnel made increasingly poor tactical decisions during critical operations. Commanders discovered that soldiers under Pervitin's long-term influence couldn't be relied upon for complex missions requiring judgment and coordination. What had initially been an enhancement to military effectiveness was becoming a serious liability that undermined basic military functionality. Medical officers noticed that soldiers were requiring progressively larger doses to achieve the same performance benefits that had once been provided by small amounts. What had initially required a single 3 milligram tablet now demanded multiple pills consumed throughout the day, with some personnel taking doses that exceeded recommended levels by enormous margins. This escalation created severe supply shortages that forced difficult decisions about resource allocation during active campaigns. The tolerance development wasn't gradual, but seemed to accelerate rapidly once it began. Soldiers who had been using standard doses for months would suddenly find them completely ineffective, demanding double or triple quantities to maintain basic functionality. This created a vicious cycle where supply requirements grew exponentially, while military effectiveness continued declining. Perhaps most concerning was the emergence of what military doctors termed breakdown episodes, sudden, complete collapses that occurred without warning during military operations. Soldiers would suddenly fall unconscious, not from physical injuries or enemy action, but from complete nervous system exhaustion. These individuals often required immediate evacuation from active combat zones, reducing the effective strength of their units precisely when military pressure was most intense. The breakdown episodes were unpredictable and seemed to strike the most experienced, previously reliable personnel. Units would lose key soldiers, including sergeants and squad leaders, during critical moments when their leadership and experience were most desperately needed. The randomness of these collapses created constant uncertainty within military formations. German military leadership found themselves confronting an uncomfortable and increasingly urgent reality. Their miracle enhancement was beginning to systematically consume and destroy the very forces it was supposed to strengthen. The substance that had promised to create superior soldiers was instead creating damaged, unreliable personnel who posed risks to themselves and their comrades. As the war progressed into 1941 and beyond, reports from frontline units painted increasingly disturbing pictures of German soldiers operating under Pervitin's long-term influence. Personnel who had become dependent on the substance often experienced extreme paranoia, vivid hallucinations, and violent mood swings when unable to obtain their next scheduled dose. These weren't isolated incidents affecting a small number of problem cases, but systematic breakdowns occurring across multiple units, different theaters of operation, and various levels of military hierarchy. The transformation that regular Pervitin use created in individual soldiers was both profound and terrifying to witness. Individual case studies from military medical files revealed the horrifying extent to which the substance could alter human personality and behavior. One thoroughly documented example involved a Wehrmacht sergeant who had been using Pervitin consistently for over 8 months during the Eastern Front campaign. Fellow soldiers reported that he had gradually begun displaying increasingly unpredictable violent behavior, attacking both enemy prisoners and his own men, without apparent provocation or rational cause. The sergeant's unit commander documented that the man's eyes had taken on a permanent glassy appearance, reflecting light in ways that seemed unnatural and disturbing to those around him. He spoke in rapid, disconnected sentences that often made little logical sense, jumping between topics with no apparent connection. Most troubling, he had begun to display complete paranoia about his fellow soldiers, becoming convinced that routine military orders were actually coded messages meant to expose him to enemy fire. Another extensively documented case file described a tank crew that had been consuming Pervitin continuously during the advance into the Soviet Union. The crew had maintained remarkable performance for weeks, operating their vehicle with precision and endurance that exceeded all expectations. However, when their Pervitin supply was disrupted for 3 consecutive days, due to supply line problems, the crew members began experiencing severe withdrawal symptoms while still operating their combat vehicle in active engagement zones. The tank commander became convinced that his own crew members were enemy agents who had infiltrated his unit and were attempting to sabotage their mission from within. His paranoia escalated rapidly, reaching the point where he began making accusations against soldiers he had served with for months. The situation became so dangerous that the commander had to be physically restrained by his subordinates to prevent him from using his sidearm against crew members he now perceived as mortal enemies. Military hospitals located behind the front lines began receiving soldiers who had completely lost touch with objective reality. These individuals often continued believing they were engaged in active combat operations, attacking medical personnel whom they perceived as enemy forces attempting to capture or interrogate them. Standard psychiatric treatments proved entirely ineffective, as the chemical damage to their nervous systems had created symptoms that existing medical knowledge couldn't adequately address or treat. The medical staff treating these cases reported that affected soldiers displayed symptoms unlike anything documented in previous military psychiatric literature. Traditional shell shock or combat fatigue involved temporary psychological responses to extreme stress. The Pervitin cases represented permanent alterations to brain chemistry that didn't respond to rest, counseling, or conventional medical intervention. Perhaps most disturbing were the cases involving soldiers who had developed what medical personnel termed combat automatism, a condition where individuals continued performing military functions without any conscious awareness or emotional engagement. These soldiers would follow orders mechanically, maintain their equipment obsessively, and execute combat maneuvers with technical precision, but displayed no recognition of their surroundings, fellow soldiers, or even their own identity. The addiction that accompanied long-term Pervitin use brought with it severe depression, persistent hallucinations, dangerous dehydration, and constant nausea, all potentially catastrophic symptoms for soldiers operating in active combat situations. What had begun as a program designed to create superior warriors had instead produced damaged individuals who were often more dangerous to their own forces than to enemy personnel. The transformation was so complete and disturbing that some officers began referring to heavily affected personnel as the walking dead, soldiers who continued functioning mechanically but had lost most aspects of normal human behavior, emotional response, and rational judgment. These men had become something between human and machine, retaining physical capabilities while losing the psychological qualities that made them effective soldiers and reliable comrades. Military leadership began recognizing that they had created a category of personnel who couldn't be trusted with weapons, couldn't be relied upon for complex missions, and couldn't be safely integrated with unaffected soldiers. The enhancement program was systematically destroying the human foundation upon which military effectiveness ultimately depended. By 1942, the The German military medical establishment could no longer ignore or minimize the catastrophic effects of widespread Pervitin distribution throughout their armed forces. Military hospitals across occupied Europe reported a dramatic and unprecedented increase in admissions for what doctors diplomatically termed nervous exhaustion, but which more accurately represented complete psychological and physical breakdowns among combat personnel who had been using the substance for extended periods. The scale of the crisis became apparent when entire military units began experiencing simultaneous performance degradation that couldn't be attributed to enemy action, supply shortages, or traditional combat stress. Companies that had been elite fighting forces just months earlier found themselves unable to execute even basic military operations. Soldiers couldn't maintain focus during routine briefings, failed to follow simple tactical orders, and displayed coordination problems that made them active liabilities in combat situations rather than assets. Regiment-level commanders began reporting that up to 30% of their personnel were experiencing some form of Pervitin-related impairment at any given time. These weren't temporary problems that could be resolved through rest or medical treatment, but persistent disabilities that appeared to be permanent. Entire battalions were being removed from frontline service due to the unreliability of their chemically affected personnel. Supply logistics became an increasingly desperate nightmare as commanders struggled to balance traditional military requirements with their troops' escalating chemical dependencies. Units demanded ever-increasing quantities of Pervitin, while their actual combat effectiveness continued declining precipitously. Military resources that should have been devoted to essential supplies like weapons, ammunition, food, and fuel were instead consumed by pharmaceutical requirements that were systematically destroying the fighting capacity they were supposed to enhance. The logistical burden became so severe that special supply units were created specifically to manage Pervitin distribution. These units required their own transportation, security, and administrative support, further diverting resources from conventional military needs. The German war machine was literally consuming itself to feed its chemical dependency. The situation reached genuine crisis proportions when German forces began experiencing what modern military analysts would recognize as unit-wide mental health emergencies. Entire battalions would suddenly become completely non-functional as personnel simultaneously experienced withdrawal symptoms, paranoid episodes, or total psychological collapse. These mass breakdowns often occurred during the most critical operations, leaving catastrophic gaps in defensive lines that enemy forces quickly identified and exploited. One particularly devastating example occurred during defensive operations in 1943, when an entire regiment responsible for holding a key strategic position experienced simultaneous Pervitin withdrawal after their supply convoy was destroyed by Allied bombing. Within hours, the regiment had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Soldiers abandoned their positions, not due to enemy pressure, but because they were experiencing hallucinations, panic attacks, and complete physical collapse from chemical withdrawal. German military leadership found themselves trapped in an impossible and increasingly desperate situation. Continuing Pervitin distribution maintained short-term unit functionality, but guaranteed long-term destruction of their personnel through addiction, psychological damage, and physical deterioration. Discontinuing the substance immediately would trigger mass withdrawal symptoms that could incapacitate entire divisions simultaneously, potentially leading to complete military collapse. Either choice threatened catastrophic military consequences, but the leadership had lost the ability to make rational decisions about the program. Too many units were already dependent on Pervitin to function at even minimal levels. Withdrawal would mean immediate military defeat, while continuation meant gradual but certain destruction of their entire fighting force. The situation was further complicated by the fact that many senior officers had also become dependent on Pervitin themselves. Decision-making at the highest levels was being influenced by individuals whose judgment had been chemically compromised. The substance that was supposed to enhance military effectiveness had begun compromising the strategic leadership responsible for directing the war effort. The realization slowly dawned among the few unaffected senior staff that they had created something unprecedented in military history, an army that was literally addicted to its own enhancement system. With no clear path toward recovery, that wouldn't result in immediate and total military collapse. The German military had become dependent on a substance that was systematically destroying its ability to wage war effectively, symptoms that could incapacitate entire divisions. Either choice threatened catastrophic military consequences. The realization slowly dawned that they had created a military force addicted to its own enhancement system, with no clear path toward recovery that wouldn't compromise their ability to continue fighting the war. Behind the strategic and tactical concerns lay thousands of individual human tragedies created by Pervitin's widespread military use. Personal letters, diaries, and medical records recovered after the war provide heartbreaking glimpses into the experiences of soldiers whose lives were systematically destroyed by their chemical dependence. These documents reveal a level of suffering that extended far beyond battlefield casualties, representing a form of institutional harm that affected entire generations. One recovered journal entry, written by a young German infantryman named Klaus in 1943, described his increasingly desperate attempts to obtain additional Pervitin supplies after his unit's official allocation had been exhausted. The entry detailed how he had begun trading away personal possessions of enormous sentimental value, including family photographs that were his only connection to home, his father's military watch from the previous war, and even his mother's letters, all in exchange for small quantities of the substance from other soldiers who had managed to acquire extra supplies. Klaus wrote about lying awake at night, not because of enemy artillery or combat stress, but because his body had forgotten how to achieve natural sleep without chemical assistance. He described the terrifying realization that he could no longer remember what normal sleep felt like, or how it felt to experience genuine emotions, rather than the artificial euphoria or crushing depression that now dominated his daily existence. His handwriting became increasingly erratic throughout the journal entries, reflecting the progressive deterioration of his motor control and cognitive function. Military medical records documented soldiers who had lost dramatic amounts of weight due to Pervitin's severe appetite-suppressing effects. Some personnel dropped below minimum weight requirements for active military duty, yet continued consuming the substance compulsively because withdrawal symptoms made normal eating physically impossible. These individuals often developed severe malnutrition and related health complications, even when adequate food supplies were readily available to their units. The weight loss wasn't gradual, but often occurred rapidly over periods of weeks, creating skeletal figures who retained their military uniforms but had lost the physical substance to fill them. Medical photographs from the period show soldiers whose appearance had been so dramatically altered by chemical dependency that they were barely recognizable as the same individuals who had entered military service just months earlier. Family correspondence revealed the profound anguish of German civilians who received letters from sons, husbands, and brothers whose personalities had been completely altered by their chemical dependence. Relatives described receiving communications from loved ones who seemed like entirely different people, writing in erratic, disjointed patterns, expressing paranoid suspicions about family members they had previously trusted, or making statements that revealed complete disconnection from reality and normal social relationships. One mother wrote to military authorities describing letters from her son that contained accusations that she was working with enemy agents, detailed plans for post-war revenge against neighbors who he claimed were plotting against him, and requests for her to perform bizarre tasks that made no logical sense. She noted that his handwriting had changed completely, becoming small, cramped, and obsessively detailed in ways that bore no resemblance to his previous correspondence. The most tragic cases involved young soldiers who had been drafted directly from civilian life and immediately introduced to Pervitin as part of their standard military service. These individuals had no baseline experience of adult life without chemical enhancement. They had never developed normal coping mechanisms for stress, fatigue, emotional challenges, or social interaction without pharmaceutical assistance. When the war ended and Pervitin's supplies became unavailable, many of these young men found themselves completely unable to function in peacetime society. They had no reference point for normal human emotional responses, no experience with natural sleep patterns, and no understanding of how to manage daily challenges without chemical enhancement. Their entire adult development had occurred under artificial chemical influence. Veterans' families reported that their returning soldiers were like strangers who happened to share familiar faces. The personality changes were so profound that many wives and parents felt they were living with completely different people who bore only physical resemblance to their loved ones. Divorce rates among returning Pervitin users exceeded normal post-war averages by enormous margins, as families struggled to rebuild relationships with individuals whose fundamental personalities had been chemically altered. The personal cost extended far beyond the war's conclusion, creating a generation of veterans whose lives had been permanently damaged by their exposure to systematic chemical enhancement. These weren't temporary problems that could be resolved through time, therapy, or medical treatment, but permanent alterations to brain chemistry and personality that would affect these individuals for the remainder of their lives. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that most of these soldiers had never volunteered for chemical experimentation. They had simply followed military orders, trusting that their leadership was providing them with tools that would help them survive combat and serve their country effectively. Instead, they had been turned into unwitting subjects in a massive pharmaceutical experiment that prioritized short-term military advantage over long-term human welfare. As Germany's overall military situation deteriorated throughout 1943 and 1944, the problems created by systematic Pervitin use dramatically accelerated the collapse of their fighting effectiveness. Supply lines that had once delivered consistent pharmaceutical supplies to frontline units became increasingly unreliable due to Allied bombing campaigns, partisan activity, and the general breakdown of German logistics networks. This created unpredictable withdrawal episodes among combat units at precisely the moments when military performance was most critical. The deteriorating supply situation created a vicious cycle that compounded existing problems. Units that had become dependent on regular Pervitin supplies found their combat effectiveness declining rapidly when deliveries became sporadic. Commanders faced the impossible choice of using increasingly scarce supplies to maintain current operations, or hoarding reserves for anticipated future crises. Either decision risked immediate tactical disasters. The Normandy landings in June 1944 provided a stark and thoroughly documented demonstration of how chemical dependence had fundamentally undermined German defensive capabilities. Many units responsible for defending the Atlantic Wall had been consuming Pervitin regularly for months or years, creating a defensive force that was simultaneously dependent on chemical enhancement and vulnerable to supply disruption. When the massive Allied bombardment preceding the invasion began, it didn't just destroy German fortifications and equipment, it also disrupted the carefully maintained supply networks that delivered Pervitin to defensive positions. Within hours of the bombardment's commencement, German units found themselves fighting a complex two-front war against the massive invasion forces landing on the beaches and against their own severe withdrawal symptoms. Contemporary reports from German commanders during the Normandy campaign describe military units that simply ceased functioning as cohesive fighting forces. Soldiers abandoned their defensive positions not because of overwhelming enemy pressure, but because they were experiencing severe hallucinations, panic attacks, or complete physical collapse from chemical withdrawal. Entire sections of the defensive line became unmanned as personnel became incapacitated by their body's chemical dependency. One particularly well-documented case involved a Wehrmacht battalion defending a critical road junction inland from the beaches. The unit had maintained its position effectively during the initial assault phases, but when their Pervitin supply was cut off by Allied interdiction, the battalion commander reported that his soldiers began experiencing mass psychological breakdown within 24 hours. Personnel reported seeing enemy tanks that weren't present, hearing artillery bombardments during quiet periods, and perceiving orders that were never issued. The retreat from France and subsequent fighting during Germany's defense of its own territory became chaotic, partly because many German units could no longer maintain basic military organization and discipline. Personnel who should have been implementing strategic withdrawals, establishing defensive positions, and coordinating with adjacent units were instead focused on securing their next dose of Pervitin or dealing with the increasingly severe consequences of enforced abstinence. The breakdown of military discipline became so severe that some German units experienced higher casualties from friendly fire incidents than from enemy action. Soldiers experiencing withdrawal-induced hallucinations would fire on their own forces, believing they were engaging enemy infiltrators. Command and control became virtually impossible when unit leaders couldn't predict whether their personnel would follow orders, interpret situations accurately, or maintain basic combat discipline. Many soldiers had become trapped in a dangerous cycle where the substance's initial performance benefits were completely outweighed by the dependency, withdrawal symptoms, and psychological damage that followed. Military effectiveness became entirely subordinate to chemical logistics, creating a situation where an army's primary enemy had become its own enhancement system. The final months of the war saw German forces that were often more severely incapacitated by their pharmaceutical dependencies than by direct enemy action. Units would arrive at defensive positions in relatively good condition, only to become completely non-functional within days, as their chemical supplies were exhausted. This represented one of history's most complete examples of military self-destruction through chemical enhancement. Traditional military history focuses on battles, strategies, and tactical decisions, but the German experience with Pervitin demonstrates how internal chemical dependency can become a more decisive factor than external military pressure. The German army had essentially defeated itself through its reliance on chemical enhancement, creating vulnerabilities that Allied forces exploited more effectively than any conventional military strategy. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the full scope of Pervitin's devastating impact on their military forces became apparent to Allied investigators and medical personnel. Prisoner of war camps across Europe filled with German soldiers displaying symptoms that military medical staff had extreme difficulty categorizing or treating. These weren't traditional combat casualties with physical wounds or conventional psychological trauma, but individuals whose basic neurological and psychological functioning had been severely compromised by years of systematic chemical enhancement. Allied medical officers, many of whom were experienced in treating various forms of combat trauma, found themselves completely unprepared for the scale and nature of chemical dependency they encountered among German prisoners. Initial medical examinations revealed thousands of cases involving former German military personnel who required extended psychiatric treatment, specialized medical care, and long-term rehabilitation that existing military medical systems weren't equipped to provide. The symptoms displayed by former Pervitin users were unlike anything documented in previous military medical literature. Many exhibited permanent personality changes that bore no resemblance to their pre-war psychological profiles. Chronic insomnia affected virtually all long-term users, but unlike typical sleep disorders, this couldn't be treated with conventional medications or therapeutic interventions. The insomnia appeared to be neurologically permanent, representing fundamental damage to brain chemistry that persisted indefinitely. Severe depression was nearly universal among former users, but this wasn't the temporary depression associated with military defeat or separation from family. Medical evaluations revealed depression so profound that many individuals showed no emotional response to positive stimuli, good news about family members, or even news of the war's end. Their capacity for experiencing normal human emotions appeared to have been permanently compromised. Cognitive impairments were equally widespread and appeared to be irreversible. Former soldiers who had been intellectually capable before their military service now struggled with basic tasks like following simple instructions, remembering recent events, or maintaining attention during conversations. These weren't temporary problems that could be resolved through rest or rehabilitation, but permanent reductions in cognitive capacity. The social cost in post-war Germany was devastating and extended far beyond individual medical cases. Families across the country attempted to rebuild relationships with veterans whose personalities had been fundamentally altered by their chemical dependence. Many discovered that their returning family members were essentially strangers who happened to share familiar physical characteristics. Wives reported that their husbands had become completely different people, displaying personality traits, emotional responses, and behavioral patterns that bore no resemblance to the men they had married. Children struggled to understand why their fathers seemed unable to recognize them emotionally, even while remembering them intellectually. The chemical enhancement program had created a generation of veterans who were physically present but psychologically absent from their own families. Employment became virtually impossible for many former Pervitin users. Employers reported that these individuals couldn't maintain consistent work schedules, follow routine instructions, or interact normally with coworkers and customers. Many had developed compulsive behaviors that interfered with job performance, while others displayed unpredictable mood swings that made them unsuitable for workplace environments. German medical institutions in the immediate post-war period were overwhelmed by the sheer number of former military personnel requiring specialized treatment for what would now be recognized as severe stimulant addiction and associated psychological disorders. The healthcare system, already devastated by years of warfare, lacked the resources, expertise, and infrastructure necessary to address the scale of chemical dependency that had been systematically created by military policy. International medical conferences in the late 1940s featured presentations about the German Pervitin cases, as medical professionals attempted to understand and develop treatments for types of chemical dependency that had never been encountered before. The cases became subjects of medical research that continued for decades, as healthcare providers tried to develop effective treatments for the unprecedented neurological and psychological damage. Perhaps most tragically, many affected individuals never achieved meaningful recovery of normal psychological functioning. The generation of young German men who had been exposed to systematic Pervitin use during their formative adult years often remained permanently damaged throughout their remaining lives. They were unable to experience normal emotional responses, maintain stable personal relationships, or adapt successfully to peacetime civilian society. The chemical enhancement program that had promised to create superior soldiers had instead created a massive, permanent public health crisis that persisted for decades after the war's conclusion. The human cost of the Pervitin experiment extended far beyond military casualties, representing one of history's most comprehensive examples of how pharmaceutical experimentation can create suffering that spans generations. The Pervitin experiment represents one of history's most comprehensive examples of the dangers inherent in chemical human enhancement. What began as a seemingly scientific approach to improving military performance became a cautionary tale about the unpredictable consequences of pharmacological intervention in human physiology and psychology. Modern military analysts studying the German experience with Pervitin have identified several critical factors that contributed to the program's catastrophic failure. The absence of long-term testing meant that military leaders had no understanding of the cumulative effects of sustained stimulant use. The pressure of wartime conditions prevented careful observation of side effects that might have been detected in peacetime research environments. The systematic nature of Pervitin distribution created a situation where individual choice was removed from the equation. Soldiers weren't making informed decisions about chemical enhancement. They were following military orders that required them to consume substances whose long-term effects were completely unknown. This created ethical problems that extend far beyond military effectiveness concerns. The German experience also demonstrated how chemical enhancement can create strategic vulnerabilities that are not immediately apparent. An army dependent on pharmaceutical supplies becomes vulnerable to disruption of those supply lines in ways that conventional forces are not. The need to maintain chemical logistics can compromise military flexibility and strategic options. Perhaps most importantly, the Pervitin program showed how chemical enhancement can create a feedback loop where short-term benefits mask long-term degradation until the damage becomes irreversible. Military leaders continued the program because it appeared to be working, even as it was systematically destroying the forces it was meant to strengthen. The lessons from this dark chapter continue to influence modern military policy regarding pharmaceutical enhancement and the ethical boundaries of human performance modification in combat situations. The story of Pervitin serves as a permanent reminder of the dangers that emerge when the pursuit of enhanced human performance overrides concerns about long-term consequences and human welfare. The German military's chemical enhancement program created suffering that extended far beyond the war itself, affecting not just the soldiers who consumed the substance, but their families and communities for generations. Modern debates about human enhancement, performance substances, and the ethics of chemical modification often reference the Pervitin experiment as an example of how quickly enhancement programs can transform from apparent solutions into humanitarian disasters. The speed with which German society embraced chemical enhancement and the subsequent reluctance to acknowledge its destructive effects illustrates how easy it is for individuals and institutions to ignore warning signs when chemical substances promise seemingly miraculous benefits. The pharmaceutical industry today faces questions about the ethical boundaries of performance enhancement that echo the issues raised by Pervitin's development and marketing. The responsibility of manufacturers, medical professionals, and government regulators to prevent similar tragedies requires constant vigilance and a willingness to prioritize long-term human welfare over short-term performance gains. Military historians continue studying the German experience with Pervitin as part of broader research into the limits of human performance modification. The lessons learned from this catastrophic experiment inform contemporary discussions about the proper role of pharmaceutical enhancement in military operations and the safeguards necessary to protect personnel from similar exploitation. The men who consumed Pervitin were not volunteers in a scientific experiment. They were victims of a system that prioritized military effectiveness over human dignity and welfare. Their experiences serve as a permanent warning about the costs of treating human beings as experimental subjects in the pursuit of enhanced performance capabilities. The substance that promised to turn soldiers into superior warriors instead created monsters, not through any supernatural transformation, but through the very human tragedy of chemical dependence and systematic exploitation. Their story remains one of the most compelling arguments for ethical restraint in human enhancement research, and a sobering reminder that the pursuit of superhuman capabilities often leads to profoundly human suffering. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.